All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in to another Concrete Ontario webinar. Happy New Year. Today's topic is the ECA Application Process and MOE Plant Inspections. As always, your facilitators this morning are myself, Alan Carey, Technical Services Engineer for Concrete Ontario, and we also have Bart Cantor, the President of Concrete Ontario. And just to go over some housekeeping items before we get started, pretty much as always, just to help new participants understand how we run things here. So it will be about a 45 to 50-minute webinar this morning. We do have two presenters, and we will leave a little time at the end for questions. All participants are currently muted and will remain that way for the entire webinar. If you do have a question, please use the GoToWebinar questions pane at the right side of your screen and type in your questions. The webinar will be recorded and posted on the Concrete Ontario YouTube channel. And to make it easier for everybody, we will email a copy of the presentation in PDF format and a link to the YouTube video as well, just to make access easier to everything that we're doing today. In terms of your presenters, your first presenter is Neil Chan from BCX. So Neil is a senior environmental engineer. And as one of BCX senior technical engineers and project managers, his efforts involve emission inventory development and advanced air dispersion modeling for simple and complex facilities in support of environmental compliance approvals, or ECAs, environmental activity and sector registries, ESER, air quality studies for environmental assessments, EA, site plan approvals, rezoning applications, etc., and all sorts of annual reporting. Your other presenter will be Petra Litovsky from HGC Engineering. Petra is a project consultant, and HGC Engineering is a consulting firm specializing exclusively in noise, vibration, and acoustics. His area of expertise includes environmental noise assessments and development of noise control recommendations for industrial facilities, infrastructure projects, building acoustics, and large-scale noise mapping using computational acoustic modeling. He has substantial experience with preparing supporting documentation for ECAs for the Ontario Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and he has completed hundreds of noise assessment reports for that purpose, among which approximately 50 were ready-mix plants. So welcome, guys. Thank you very much for coming in this morning. Now, the reason Petra and Neil are here this morning is to go over the ECA approval process. And from an association standpoint, we do have 280 eco-certified plants, which means each plant that is certified does need an MOE reference number or an ECA to be approved under our plant certification program. To be certified, you do have to call in consultants such as Neil and Petra to do the modeling and the assessment and to submit this application to the MOE for review. Once it is approved or there is a reference number, we're able to certify you as well, as long as you meet the other requirements of the audit. Having said all that, I will turn it over to Neil first to go over the air portion of the ECAs.
Thank you, Alan. So as Alan explained, these slides will be available online. There's purposely more information on the slides, but I won't go into detail of every single slide or else it'll just take too long. So let's get started. Here's an outline. I'll first go through the types of ECA, ECA application components, the ECA application submission process, and some ECA application challenges. So first off, RMC plants are not eligible for ESER. They do fall under the ECA domain due to their NICE code. So, you have to get an ECA for RMC plant. You can't do an ESER for it. The first type of ECA approval is a standard one. So what it does is it lists its production rate, typically an hourly or daily rate, and each piece of equipment and its operating parameters. So you can see that below there's an example, ready-mix concrete batching plant. Its production rate, and you'll have a list of equipment like, your bag houses and loading point dust collectors, etc. The second type of ECA is called a limited operational flexibility, LOF. So the difference with this one is it provides the facility production limit, usually an annual rate, it defines an operating envelope, so a description of the processes. So if you look at the example below, you'll see it's a ready-mix concrete batching plant consisting of the following processes and supporting units like aggregate delivery, cement delivery, concrete batching. So it's something more like generic of the operation. It doesn't list each individual equipment. So yeah, that's about it. It might list some equipment that has specific operational parameters, but usually for a ready-mix plant, you wouldn't really have that. So a major difference between a standard one and an LOF ECA is that the addition of equipment and like emission points like silos, dust collectors, or changing a loading point, relocation of equipment on site, change in property line, increase in the rate used or composition of raw materials, changes to ancillary operations such as process heating. For an LOF, you wouldn't need to submit an ECA amendment. But for a standard ECA, you would have to submit an ECA amendment. There are changes that you can't make to an LOF ECA though. For example, you can't change the facility description, such as if it's a RMC plant, it can't be changed to a HMA hot mix asphalt plant. So that's changing like the process, the description envelope. You can't do that. You can't exceed the production limit, like the annual production limit. You can't exceed that. And if there's any specific operating conditions for like very specific equipment, such as like boilers more than 10 MMBTU per hour, or cement kilns, thermal oxidizers, there may be conditions in the LOF ECA that you can't change it, or else you'll need an amendment. So benefits of having an ECA with an LOF is, for the company, you have the ability to plan and make changes in a timely manner because you don't have to submit an ECA amendment. You can make modifications and routine process changes that are predictable. And usually the LOF permit condition for complaints removes the requirement to report complaints to the ministry. Instead, it requires the facility to prepare a written report within 1 week of the complaint, and this report must be kept on file at the facility. For the ministry, it's improved compliance through an ongoing facility-wide maintenance of the SDM and the AAR. So what's the price for this flexibility? So when you maintain up-to-date, you have to maintain, for an ECA with LOF, you have to maintain an up-to-date ESDM and AAR. These do not need to be submitted to the MOE, but they have to be available for any like ministry inspections. And prior to any changes you make, like say you're adding a silo, the facility must assess it internally, and do the modeling and the air and noise assessment to ensure that the air and noise limits are still being met. All these changes must be put into modification log, and it's usually a very simple document. So on an annual basis, the facility must submit what you call written summary form to the ministry describing any changes or if you don't have any changes. So similar to standard ECA, an ECA with LOF requires an ESDM and AAR available to the general public, the executive summaries. And if the ECA with the LOF is not amended prior to its LOF expiry date, usually it's a 10-year expiry date, it just reverts to like a standard ECA. So in that case, if you make changes, after 10 years, you would have to submit an ECA amendment. Okay, the ECA components. Major components of an ECA is the application form, the emission summary and dispersion modeling report, that's the air report, and the noise report, then the application fee. There are a bunch of forms, like the basic forms are like the application form. There's a primary noise screening form if your facility is far away that it might not need acoustic assessment. There's some emission summary checklist, and some additional forms which are more technical would be if you require, like, for example, Schedule 3 standards in advance, there's a form for that. Or if you want to use a specific air dispersion model, there's a form for that. And also some requests for specific met data from MOE to do the air modeling. So those are more of the technical forms involved. So for the ESDM report, the air report, it must follow the ministry's guidance document. So there is a guidance document from the MOE. So that's why a lot of times it's very complex. So it has to be prepared by a qualified air consultant. The main components in the ESDM report are, site and process description, the identification of air emission sources and contaminants, assessment of the significance or insignificance of certain sources and contaminants, the maximum operating scenarios, air emission estimates, we do air dispersion modeling, and we compare the results to the ACB benchmark list to see if the site passes. Some typical air emission sources in an RMC plant, considered significant, would be fugitive emissions from material handling, conveyor transfers, your silo dust collectors, your loading point, your mixing, if you have wet plant, the mixing loading, you have a loading point or central mixer dust collector, and the combustion equipment for the process heating. And often insignificant, what they consider insignificant in terms of the guidelines. It's not always the case, but most of the time it's wind erosion, because this will be managed by your best management plan for fugitive dust. Any road dust, same thing. Admixtures that are non-volatile. Any on-site vehicle fueling, maintenance activities, and comfort heating. So typical air contaminants for the air report, ESN report that we assess is, particulate matter, RCS or crystalline silica, Portland cement, slag, calcium oxide, and essentially whatever's in your cement ESDS and slag ESDS. Those are contaminants that we do have to assess now. Maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, the MOE is more looking for, just particulate matter, maybe nitrogen oxide, and maybe Portland cement. But now when we do the assessment, it's much more complex because we have to essentially, assess every single contaminant in your SDS. So that's something to think of. That's why the projects are pretty big. Data collection. So information that the facility needs to provide to your consultants is the owner and applicant information, property line, facility layout, any dimensions, inputs for calculating the emission rates, like the production rates, and modeling source parameters, which is essentially like your stack dimensions, so we can do the air modeling. It's very important to emphasize that this information should be very, you should really provide it in very accurate, because it'll be cost added project if there are a lot of changes throughout the project, and people keep changing their mind on certain parameters. And the property line, this thing is very important because for air dispersion modeling, we model to the property line and beyond. So if you have a property line that's bigger, but you gave a smaller one, that's kind of your results will be higher, and vice versa. If you have a smaller property line but you give something big, that's inaccurate. Facility layout and dimensions. We also need the dimensions of the various buildings and tiers for the air dispersion modeling. And just keep in mind, sometimes the aerial photographs, say for example on Google, they might be old. So we do need recent, available, recent aerials of the facility. For calculating emission rates, it's very important. What we do in terms of the guideline, it has to be like a worst case scenario. So the production rates given need to be kind of like a realistic maximum scenario that you would produce at. And also we need the SDS of the cementitious materials or any other aggregates that you use, because we do have to, the MOE does require us to assess all the contaminants in your materials. And then we pair these emissions rates with the modeling sources. For stacks and vents, we do need the flow rate, exit diameter, height above the ground and above the roof, the exit temperature, and the description of the stack, like the type of stack is a vertical or like a rain cap stack. This is more important when we're assessing the loading point dust collector, because that's one of the major emission sources for particulate, so that parameter needs to be correct. And the ECA submission process. So first we have to submit one hard copy and one soft copy of the application package to the Ministry Client Service and Permissions branch, also known as the Approvals branch. One hard copy to the district office where the plant's located. So what happens when the application gets submitted? It first goes to an application assessment officer, which screens the application for completeness. So this is not a technical review. They just screen it for, they make sure you have all the MOE fees, application forms, the ESDM and AAR have all the all the sections that they require. And after that, they would give you a MOE reference letter, usually about maybe 2 weeks after the submission when they get it. Then the ministry posts the application on the EBR for 45 days for public content comments. So it's very important also about this EBR posting because, you know, sometimes, usually not, but like assessment officers can put like a wrong description on the EBR. So there's a big difference between RMC plan and cement plan, right, to the public. So, you know, we usually check, make sure the EBR posting is correct. The ministry completes the technical review. That's when a review engineer at the ministry gets it. They might ask some questions to consultant, air and noise consultants, and then the ministry issues an ECA. So some typical challenges with an ECA is they've been, you know, as I explained before, they're more complex compared to the last 5 years ago. The MOE wants to know about more contaminants compared to before. So some typical challenges include application fee calculation. Sometimes there's some glitches in their application form, so the application fee doesn't calculate properly. But what happens is MOE either, you know, gives you a refund or asks for more money during the submission when the assessment officer gets it. So, but it might delay the, you know, the submission slightly. We need the proof of legal name. It's important because they'll put the legal name on the ECA and not like your operating name. So if you have an operating name, you have to give like the, you know, legal name also, because that's what's going to be on the ECA. The definition of property, the description on EBR, have to make sure it's correct. Often, usually they give a draft ECA before they issue the final one to the consultants and the client, so you can check that there's any errors in it, but they are not obligated to give you a draft ECA. So sometimes, you know, the ECAs just go into the client's mail or consultant's mail, and, you know, there was no like draft review that we could look at. So if there's any errors in it, we can't really fix it without an amendment. So that's the disadvantage, that's a challenge. Also, it really depends on the review engineer. Like some review engineers are different. So like in terms of technical methodology, like sometimes there'll be some inconsistencies. So that's one of the challenges. Yeah, and delays in receiving the final copy of ECA. So sometimes, you know, they've done all the technical reviews, but for some reason there's a delay on the MOE side of issuing the final one. Okay. Some technical challenges include it's reduction in types of emission source that be considered insignificant and increase the work to justify their insignificance. The expansion of the number of contaminants required in detailed assessment. The changes in emission calculation methodologies, like I said before, some review engineers might not be familiar with RMC plans. They would ask for, like, you know, a lot of, you know, detailed questions in it, which would increase the cost of the project because the consultants will have to, you know, provide more information, do some more modeling for them. Mitigation is a hard one. This is probably one of the biggest ones. You know, it's obvious that we want the highest reduction rate for the ECA, but are not willing to mitigate the sources. So, you know, if say you have a small property line and you do want high production, but you don't want to add any enclosures or dust collectors, that is a challenge, I think. Also, for the reviews, if there's a lot of scrutiny from the MOE, if your air limits are above 90% limit, so they'll kind of look at it in more detail. So, but, you know, we know it is passing, it is below the limit, but they still, you know, would ask more details on the, you know, calculations if it's above 90%. And I explained before, emission source is very close to property line, that would get into mitigation issues, so one of the challenges.
All right, thank you, Neil. We'll turn it over to Petra now to go over the noise portion of the ECA.
Good morning, everyone. You join us today for this webinar to learn about the process, how to apply for an approval, for the environmental compliance approval from the ministry. And you are all probably operators of ready-mix plants, or you are perhaps owners. So I would like to, in this presentation, go over some basics that are involved in getting the approval. Namely, the main 3 points that I'd like to discuss, and then you need to know is what is involved in terms of the paperwork. Then you will probably want to know what sort of practical implications there are with getting these assessments done. There may be based on the results of the actual studies, the need to modify your plant or install noise control measures. So we can go over those and what those typically involve. And as a third step, we're going to discuss a little bit the timing of the application. How long does it take for you to complete the assessment and to get your approval? And also we're going to touch on the cost of this entire thing. So first of all, I'm just going to generally summarize what is the environmental compliance approval. I'm going to probably overlap a little bit with what Neil was saying, but just to recapitulate, essentially, the environmental compliance approval is a legal document that you need to operate legally in Ontario. In fact, there are different types of approvals, but we know for the ready-mix plant, most of you will probably just have the typical simple environmental compliance approval that essentially lists all the equipment that is installed at your site and determines the conditions under which that equipment can operate. It's going to also have some other conditions. For example, if your site needs noise control measures, the approval is going to list all those measures. And in fact, the ministry is going to sometimes send an officer to your plant, and they're going to ask for the approval. They're going to go over it to make sure that everything that is stated in the approval has been in fact installed, and then the facility operates within the conditions described in that approval. Now, some other things that the approval can have is, for example, a condition for an audit, and that sometimes when you already have an approval, in fact, that may not be sufficient, but there may be a condition for you to conduct an acoustic audit, which means that essentially you have to hire another consultant to go again to your site to take noise readings to determine whether your site meets limits, and then get a report from that consultant and submit it again to the ministry, and then only after that the ECA is fully valid, and the ministry is going to be satisfied. So now, when you know what an approval is, this picture here is showing just a general simplified scheme of what you need to do to obtain the approval. So you can see in that bubble at the top, essentially, you first need to hire a consultant who's gonna file in the application that goes to the ministry for you. The application is essentially a form that you can download from the internet, but it has a whole bunch of steps that need to be filled in. And as part of the application, you will need a consultant who's going to complete your air emission report, which is the ESDM report that Neil was talking about. And in parallel to that, you will also need a noise report for which you need to hire a noise consultant. So you have to have two consultants typically on board. Sometimes you're going to find a firm that can do both of these reports together. And once you have completed the assessment, and the assessments, they must show that your site is in compliance, then you can submit the application with some additional fees. The ministry is going to go through the application, screen it for some minimum requirements, and it's going to conduct a technical review to check that all the assumptions and all the calculations in those technical reports, in the air emission report and the noise report, are correct, and they're satisfied with it. And then only after they're going to issue the ECA. And then sometimes, even if they issue an ECA, they may ask for an audit, which I mentioned it earlier, that the audit is sometimes there's a special condition where you have to hire another consultant to check again, essentially, on the correctness of the technical studies. Now, going forward, I'm just going to be talking about the noise report and what you need to know about completing the noise report. So when you hire your noise consultant, the first thing that's going to happen is that they will want to come to your site to take noise measurements. So they will give you a timeline, and then when you agree on a day when everything at your site is operating normally, they're going to show up with a microphone and take a whole bunch of measurements. They're going to take noise measurements of all the individual sources that are at your site, which means the trucks and front end loader and the loading point dust collector and so on. And they're going to take that information to do their analysis. And this is where you need to know that some input is needed from your side, where the consultants are going to be asking a whole bunch of questions so they can complete their calculations. And those questions are typically going to be around how much, what's your processing rate, how many trucks can you process per hour, what are the truck routes that get in and get out, how long can your front loader operate, when do you receive your cement tanker truck, and so on. And all this information they're going to then use together with the measurements to build an acoustical model and to come up with results. Essentially, the results then reflect the sound levels from your site at the nearest typically residential homes or any other noise sensitive land, which can include a hospital or child care center and so on. And in most cases, it's going to be some sort of a residential dwelling. Now, when the results are available, they are compared with the applicable limit, and the limits they are defined by the Ministry of the Environment. They do change depending on the environment in which the nearest noise receptors are. So for example, if your plant is in a more rural area, then those limits tend to be more stringent than if your plant is in a more urban area with a lot of background sound and so on. So now the question is, or the easiest, more straightforward way how to complete the assessment is, if your site now meets the limit, then there's no problem, and you just you have a report and file an application, and then essentially you get your approval. Now the challenge is appears for those sites that are found to exceed the limit, and this is where you have to take another step before, in fact, completing the actual AAR that is going to then be submitted in the application, and that is you have to complete this noise abatement action plan. And the noise abatement action plan is probably going to be the most single important point in this process for most of the sites that exceed the limits. And now you're probably thinking, well, does my site exceed the limits? Well, it's really hard to tell in general without completing the actual assessment. But in our experience, it is not uncommon that ready-mix plants do require some sort of a noise control measures, just given the nature of the activities that are conducted, because some of the noise sources tend to be fairly loud, and especially in cases where the ready-mix plants are located relatively close to residential areas, some noise control measures are going to be needed. So let's take a look at what happens if you are in the category when you require a noise abatement action plan. In that case, your consultant, based on the calculations that they did at the outset of the project, they will be able to tell you specifically what source at your site is the problem and how you can fix it. Now, there really are a bunch of options as to what the solutions are going to be, and are very individual. But in general, your number one source and number one problem in most cases is going to be the unloading tanker truck that, as you know, has the blower behind the cabin, and it tends to be fairly loud, and it's typically the number one problem. The other sources on the second place are going to be the ready-mix trucks, whether they are at the loading point while loading or at the slumping point. And you know that oftentimes when these trucks sit there, they rev up their engines, and that produces fairly significant noise. If we're going to look at some other sources, the front end loader, it can be a problem. Sometimes your baghouse or the signal horn and any other trucks really. In terms of mitigation, once you let's say that it is the case that one of these sources will, or more of these sources will require mitigation, that really there's a range of options that you can consider, and then you're going to encounter. Before we get to that, let me just allow a brief explanation of what is it that we're actually doing here, and what is it that the noise consultants are measuring. So I just included this graph that is showing the concept of what we call the equivalent sound pressure level. And the equivalent sound pressure level, in your case, that's the one resulting number that's going to represent the sound level from your site. And now that is essentially indicated by the orange line across, and it's in this case it's approximately 62 decibels. So let's say the site from the sound level from your site is total over 1 hour. It's an average level that equals to 62 decibels. Now, the blue line, there is the sound level that actually occurs over the duration of 1 hour at your site. You can see that it's intermittent, and it can change over time. So as the trucks go in, and as other activities are happening, and the tanker trucks come in and go out, and front end loader passes, the sound level is never going to be steady. But essentially, the level that your consultant is going to assess is one number that represents the logarithmic average of the intermittent sound levels that are occurring at your site. And now, why this is important? Because this just indicates how important it is to consider some of the operating times, some of the equipment. So, for example, when if we ever encounter a problem with the front-end loader, there's always an option, if possible, to shorten its operating time, and you could see how any reduction in time exposure and time operation essentially reduces the overall LAQ, the overall level from the site. So that just brings us to the available noise control measures that you may encounter, and then can essentially sort them into two categories. There can be administrative or physical, and there's of course some overlap between them. The administrative noise controls really they are going to include restricting the time of the operation of some of the equipment. They may include rescheduling of unloading of your tanker truck, for example, from if maybe you don't need to unload it between 6 and 7 in the morning, it can come a little bit later when the hours when the noise limits are a lot higher. It can also include some optimization of the truck routes, where if there's a house really close to the property line, you can just choose to drive the truck somewhere else. And then of course, the physical noise control measures, they're going to include a whole bunch of options, which really are going to range depending the appropriateness of those noise control measures for your site is going to really depend. Sometimes it is possible to just change direction of your slumping position, of your loading position, because the sound from the unloading of the loading truck is really directional, because it comes from the front of the radiator of the truck. So sometimes you can just turn the truck in another direction, and that's going to solve your issue. If that is impossible, you can try to hide the truck behind existing structures, or in other cases, you will need to build noise barriers, either at the property line, or sometimes you will need to build a barrier very close to the actual loading positions, which in some cases can be quite challenging, because it's going to affect the trucking flows within the site itself. So we can also look at introducing dedicated enclosures for some equipment. For example, if you can't rotate your unloading cement tanker truck, you may just buy a dedicated blower that's going to be installed within the building, and essentially in the most extreme cases we will be looking at enclosures, which means that any equipment that makes any noise that needs to be put inside a building, essentially. That can happen in some rare cases, but I just included here as a one variant that is fairly rare, and it's also fairly difficult to deal with. But it can happen. In terms of the barriers are going to be probably the most common solutions that you are going to be implementing. You can see that you can use almost anything as a barrier, as long as it's heavy enough. Really, no special design is required as long as the barrier is standing. It's fairly common to use concrete blocks, which are oftentimes readily available at ready-mix plants, and can be just piled up to whatever necessary height and shape and so on. Here's just for illustration one barrier that I mentioned previously. You can see that it's put together by the concrete blocks and wood. Even wood is enough as long as it's heavy enough. The interesting thing about this barrier is that this is the type of barrier that is right next to the loading point, and so you can see about how long and how big it needs to be. Really, there's on the right side of the barrier, there's a door which through the personnel can pass, just to facilitate access. this type of barrier, it's again, it's a fairly special case where the barrier is required to be placed essentially as close as possible to the loading point where it is the most effective. But you can also imagine that in some cases it can, depending on the layout of the site, it may be quite problematic to put a barrier like that right in the middle of the site. And this brings us to just the final point, which includes some of the timing that you're looking at. You can see here in the bubbles that between retaining your consultant and doing the site work, you will need about 2 weeks, next 2 weeks to get your results, another 2 weeks to write a report, some small time to submit your application. And then once the application is in at the ministry takes approximately 20 weeks. I say approximately because this time is in fact unknown. Based on our experience, it can be about 20 weeks. The ministry itself has a deadline or a minimum commitment of a minimum 1 year to deliver your ECA. So when you add all these numbers together, you can see that you're looking at a 5 to 6 month schedule to plan receiving your ECA. These times are essentially estimated minimums, so this time can be longer, especially if your site needs a noise abatement action plan where it can take quite a bit of time for you to wrap your head around what exactly needs to be done at your site, and you need to talk to your consultant to determine what's going to work. In terms of cost, it is of course difficult to comment on how much the noise control measures are going to be, because that's going to fluctuate. For the consulting costs, just to get your report, you're going to be looking at somewhere between $10,000 to $20,000 for your reports, and then there is an application fee that is submitted to the ministry. The application fee, in most cases, is around $3,000. And that is for me. Thank you for your attention.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Petra. Now we've covered air, we've covered noise. Now we're just going to look at in terms of site inspections, when the ministry actually comes to site to investigate your site or look at your site, what's actually involved there, and we'll turn it back over to Neil.
Thanks. So an overview of the presentation: what prompts a ministry site inspection, how to prepare for an inspection, what to do and not to do during the inspection, and inspection follow-ups. So what prompts the ministry site inspection? First, it's complaints, air or noise complaints from your neighbors. So you might want to minimize those. Recent ECA application submission, so the district officer knows you submit an ECA application, they may want to check out the plant. Follow up from a previous inspection that results in an action item, maybe they want to follow up with you, and just random curiosity. How to prepare for a ministry inspection? Often the ministry will contact you, so it's about being prepared. Clarify with them the purpose and scope of visit and how long they'll be attending and who they want to speak with. Consider working with your environmental manager or a consultant to prepare for the site visit. Several days before the visit, complete a detailed inspection of your site. Review your current ECA equipment list and conditions so that you're familiar with it, and make sure that your site is still up to date. Make sure someone who is knowledgeable about the facility operations and the permitting requirements are available to meet the ministry and lead the site tour. Consider having your environmental manager or consultant attend. Make sure some of the documentation is developed and readily available. So an example is the operations and maintenance manual, the fugitive dust management plan, complaints procedures, any training records for your staff, ESM report, and AAR. Other documentation that you might want to have available is also like your waste benefits. Say you have like a maintenance room with equipment cleaning, any sewage discharge or surcharge agreement, ECAs for subcontractors. For example, if you have a portable crusher on site crushing some reclaimed concrete, you want to have the ECAs for your subcontractors. And if you have one, a permit to take water. How to prepare for a ministry site inspection. A day before the site visit, advise your employees of the site inspection. The ministry may ask them about, ask some questions about their training. So that's why you want to have those training records. You don't want any staff to say, no, we didn't get any training. That's not good. Decide who will talk about what, and plan the kind of the site visit tour, like how you want to kind of show them the site. Arrange a space to have a discussion afterwards. During the day of the visit, we recommend that you do a final site inspection 2 hours before the site visit. You don't want to have any leaks and spills before the MOE comes. Set up a discussion room, look ready and organized. Have a pen, pad, camera ready if you need it. Initiate a visit in the discussion room first to kind of go over what you guys want to look at, and complete a visitor safety training as usual. During the site inspection, as a client, be polite, like as a facility, be polite and friendly. If you need, let your consultant be firm if needed. Don't volunteer any information, only answer questions that are asked. If you don't know how to answer, don't guess, indicate that you will respond afterwards. Okay. Make note of any observation and request the ministry makes. Keep copies of any documents that you provide, like photos or any other documentation. So, we recommend don't give them original copy or else you won't have it. So, and it's also good to have a record of what you email them. If possible, don't commit to any deadlines during the meeting. Obviously exchange contact information so you can keep in touch. Ask when you can expect a copy of their inspection report. If action items were identified during your visit, briefly discuss those action items and kind of get an idea of the urgency of each action item before the ministry leaves. After the site inspection, you want to follow up with the ministry, confirm the action items identified during the visit and the timing to complete it. Review the inspection report carefully. If there's any errors identified in the report, just let the ministry know to fix it. If there are several action items in the inspection report, the ministry may ask for an action plan be prepared, or you may want to offer to prepare an action plan. Consider reviewing the wording and commitments in the action plan with your environmental manager or your consultant before submitting to the ministry. The ministry may schedule a second site visit depending on if they want it or not. All right, that's done for tonight.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Neil. We do have some questions. Maybe I'll turn it over to Bart just to ask a few of the questions that we have.
One of the ones that we have here, how long do we have in order to make upgrades to the plant in terms of ECA addendums? So if you've identified, for example, that the example was given, if we're making modifications to the plant, how do you have to notify the ministry specifically? Before you do the work? After you do the work?
So it really depends on the type of the approval that you have, but I'm gonna just keep it simple and assume that we have the normal approval, not the one with any flexibility and so on, but the typical approval that essentially needs to be amended every time before we install anything new at our site. So with that said, when there are plans to install a new silo, for example, given the timelines that we saw in one of the presentations, we're really looking at a minimum timeline of 6 months before receiving our amended approval. So that before we install, we have roughly 6 months to complete the application.
Okay, great.
Can I just add to it? So technically, you would have to, have your assessment done to make sure that it's in compliance before you actually install the equipment. So.
Okay, so it's assess, allow for the time for the approval to take place, then implement the change. Okay, great. We've heard that starting in in 2020, there's going to be some changes to air modeling. What impact is that going to have to the currently certified concrete plants in the province?
So if your facility has an ECA and it was modeled in Schedule 2, kind of what we call the older MOE 346 model in February 2020, you would have to do an air mod assessment. So all the plants would have to change into air mod to do their assessments. If you didn't make any changes to your air mod, like your facility, you just have to do an air mod assessment internally. But if you did make any changes, you have to go to the typical ECA amendment approach. So, it's important to think about the, air mod assessments for the 2020.
Okay, so every member needs to review what modeling system they used previously. If it wasn't air mod, then they're going to have to go back and internally assess whether there's any implications there that they need to reset.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think you hit this one before, but how long does approval take with the MOE? And we've had members raising concerns that it's much longer than 1 year.
It can in fact be much longer than the story is that in the past the ministry had quite a bit of a backlog of these applications, and sometimes it would take them up to 5 years to actually process them. So if your experience is that your approval took more than 1 year to issue, we believe you it was indeed the case. Recently, the ministry has a new system that facilitated the approval process and sped it up quite significantly. So as of now, you can expect that if you submit an application, it will probably going to be processed within, as we said, about 5 to 6 months.
Okay, yeah. Great. Another question that comes up, and it's really a two-part question, is do concrete plants have to account for future residential development around their plants? And and the second component of that is, when changes do take place around the concrete plant, what impact does that have to its current ECA?
So why don't I start off first for the air? So in terms of air, it wouldn't be as impacted for this, like in the question, because for air, we model to the property line and beyond. So regardless, you would have to kind of meet your property line limits for the air component, but I believe noise might be different.
So with respect to noise, sorry, can you repeat the question?
So the first question was, can I be asked during the review process to account for future development? And I don't think you should be, and the second question is, if the plant's been up and running and let's say the local, a new subdivision goes in adjacent to the plant, it was farm field and now it's a subdivision.
Right.
What impact does that have on my existing ECA?
Right. Well, it can have significant impact. And so let's take a scenario where, as you say, there's a field right now, nothing is on it. And the field is, for example, a brown field, it's zoned industrial. And suddenly there are plans to develop those lands and build condominiums on it. That what do you do? Well, in that case, you really should make sure to take action before the applicant actually applied for the zoning amendment to rezone the land from industrial to residential. Because when that happens, it's a really separate process from the environmental compliance approval. But before any rezoning occurs, you really have the opportunity to object to any development and argue that it is not favorable for the operation of your site, essentially. In cases where there are vacant lands that are already zoned residential, that is a slightly different scenario. So, for example, if there is a vacant lot or an agricultural lot that allows where the zoning allows a residential home on it, but the home isn't there, then the situation is that you do have to include or you have to consider a potential that there is going to be a home in your study, and you have to consider, you have to assess what the impact would be. But if there would be an excess, a sound level excess over limit at that location, you don't have to install any noise control measures until that house is actually in place.
Okay, so you'd estimate the worst possible location for that house to be located, and then
there are in fact there are rules. There are rules for where we consider that worst case location to be. It's not necessarily the worst case location, but there are rules. The rule is that within that lot, we choose an area that is 100 by 100 meters, and we choose a point right in the middle of it. And then there's a little bit of a free interpretation as to where that square is going to go on the property.
Yeah.
And it should really go at a place where we can reasonably expect the development to be. So close to the road, or where you can see that the other houses at the neighboring properties are.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions?
No.
I thought I would just mention, and I forgot to mention in the application, that a question may come up when your site needs a noise abatement action plan. The question is now, how much time do you actually have to install the noise abatement action plan, and how does it fit into the application process? So let's say in a scenario where your site has been identified to require to install some solutions, this doesn't really affect the time that you will require to receive your application. And the way it works is that the only thing that you need to complete if you have an excess is the actual noise abatement action plan, which is a paperwork study that you include in your acoustic assessment report and submit it to the ministry. But you don't have to install physically anything until you receive the approval. And that approval and the actual application is going to include a suggested timeline for implementation of those noise control measures. And so typically, again, depending on the scale of the noise control measures that we are looking at, in our experience, the actual timelines for implementation can range between 1 or 2 up to about 3 years for a ready-mix plan. So in fact, if you do have an excess, you're gonna finish your study, submit an application, get your approval in 6 months, and then only after that you have about, let's say, 1 or 2 or 3 year window to actually install the noise control measures that are now included in the approval.
Okay, so the logic behind that obviously is you need to have the proposed solution approved by the MOE before you go to the cost of implementing it in case it's not approved.
You don't install anything without approval, including noise control measures that could help you. So it is not allowed to install anything, even if there's an excess. But on the other hand, it gives the proponent more time to call it budget and plan for any changes.
Is there an ability to request an extension if the costs are fairly significant, or you just get that first ruling initially when you get your application of here's the...
I believe that the room to negotiate the actual timeline for implementation is really before the application is submitted, and it's typically determined based on your consultation with the local district officer.
Okay.
That's gonna have an opinion on the timeline that you're proposing and whether it is reasonable. He's gonna support if you talk to the local district officer and have an agreement with him. He's gonna support the timeline that you agree on. So this is the room to negotiate the actual timeline.
Prior. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
Okay. Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you very much, Petra, for coming in. We really appreciate your expertise. If our members or the participants have any other questions, you can forward them to myself, and we'll forward on to you guys to get some questions answered. In terms of what's next for our webinars, the schedule is still being finalized. People did rave about the December webinar, cold weather concreting. So we will definitely have hot weather concreting before the summertime. We're looking at some other topics as well. We'll finalize everything in the coming weeks, and it will be sent out. If you do have any topics you would like to propose for us to do, please forward them to myself or Bart, and we'll address them in the future. Again, thank you very much for tuning in this morning. Thank you guys for coming in. Thank you, Bart, as well. And we will send out all the information in the next few weeks, the presentations, the link, and everything else we promised in the webinar. So thank you and have a great day.